Okay, come down to the front as well. Okay, good afternoon everyone, and a very warm welcome to the inaugural NTU Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities Series. Now before we start the session proper, there are two things for you to just take note. Firstly, please note that we have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. And for our audience who have joined us remotely, you can either scan this QR code that you see here on the screen, or you can also just visit the website slido.com and key in the numerical code that you see there. Secondly, in order to ensure a positive experience for everyone here today, we would appreciate if you can switch off or rather switch your phone to silent mode. Thank you. And with that, without much further ado, I'd like to invite our school chair, Professor Neil Murphy, to say a few words.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome. To those of you present here at NTU, of course, welcome, but also to everyone else who's joining us online. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Professor Derek Attridge back to NTU. He visited us previously in 2017, and on this occasion he delivers the inaugural lecture in our Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities Series. The intention of the series is to both feature and acknowledge the impact of some of the most prominent contemporary voices in the humanities. Our invitation to Professor Attridge to open the series intends to mark his varied, prolific, and hugely significant contribution to his field for more than 40 years. In the work of most scholars, it's relatively easy to identify a few primary publications or ideas upon which their reputation rests. But this is not so with Professor Attridge, primarily because he has continuously published major work and is considered a leading expert in numerous fields within literary studies throughout his career. For example, and this is a very abridged listing, he has published multiple influential volumes on James Joyce, J.M. Coetzee, and South African literature more generally. He has repeatedly addressed the significance of post-structuralism, deconstruction, affect theory in many of his books. He has published major volumes on poetry and rhythm in particular, and several seminal volumes that address the act of reading, the practice of reading critically, the status of literature as art, and all the complications involved with that, and the complex relationship between reader and literary text. Major influential books like The Singularity of Literature, originally published in 2004 and reissued in Routledge Classics series in 2017, and The Work of Literature in 2015, center on the practices of literary reading and literary criticism, on the distinctiveness, or as he has it, the inventiveness or otherness of literature, as well as raise questions as to the value and ethical potential of literature. Across all of his work, there is a persuasive insistence on the unique value of literature. He continues to make major contributions to all of the above areas. For example, in recent years, he has edited or co-edited the work of Reading and Literature and Event, 21st Century Reformulations, and his most recent single-authored volume is The Experience of Poetry from Homer's Listeners to Shakespeare's Readers, in 2019. Today's lecture, entitled Literature, Art, Craft, is sure to offer us a sense of some of his central fascinations. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Professor Attridge.
Thank you, Neil, for that introduction, which I probably won't be able to live up to. You'll be patient, I'm sure. This talk is in 4 parts, each of which has a title, and the first part is called Aesthetic Experience. Peter de Bolle begins his stimulating book, Art Matters, by summarizing the task he has set himself as follows: to arrive at a better understanding of what it is to be moved profoundly by a work of art. In elaborating this goal, de Bolle makes it clear that the kind of response he's concerned with may include an intellectual as well as an emotional dimension, what he terms, quote, the interleaving of the affective with the cognitive. My own goal in several publications over the past 2 decades has been the same, except that whereas de Bolle deals with responses to visual and musical works as well as to a poem, my focus has been primarily on literary art. What I want to ask in this talk is whether an examination of the visual arts can be helpful in thinking about the distinctive powers of literature. A question that first of all entails asking to what degree the 2 modes of art have features in common. And I should add in parenthesis that the stimulus for this thinking came from Neil Murphy and Michelle Bund, who are co-editing a volume on literature and art. It got me thinking. What I want to... the lens through which I want to engage with these questions is that of experience, as my reference to de Bolle suggests. The experience, that is, of being profoundly moved, and I would add changed, by an encounter with a work of art. In other words, I'm asking whether the experience of the viewer of a work of visual art and that of the reader of, or listener to, a work of verbal art are in important ways the same, or at least similar enough to be worth comparing, and what the payoff might be of such a comparison. Of course, not all commentators on the arts find the notion of such cross-platform parallels a useful one. Some would argue that each mode of art has its own distinctive character and should be studied in isolation, or if it is possible to generalize across various modes, such generalizations are so broad as to be uninformative. Against this view is the long philosophical tradition which takes the aesthetic to be a distinctive category, although there's very little agreement on what kind of category it is. In its earliest formulations, most influentially in Kant, the term was primarily discussed in terms of natural beauty, but in later developments, notably in Anglo-American analytic aesthetics, art takes center stage, usually on the assumption that the various modes of art can be subsumed under a single category. Gerald Levinson, in his useful overview in the Oxford Handbook of Aesthetics, which is really a handbook of analytic aesthetics, identifies 3 major conceptions of art operative in this tradition. Art as a certain kind of practice or activity or object, art as a certain kind of property, feature, or aspect of things, and art as a certain kind of attitude, perception, or experience. And it's this third conception that's my starting point. The starting point I share with phenomenological approaches to art, although there are significant differences between the way I want to develop the question of experience in relation to art and the procedures of phenomenology. One of the first issues that presents itself when confronting the question of the viewer's experience of works of visual art is what, like many others, I'm calling the issue of craft. A significant element in the pleasure produced by many visual artworks arises from the evidence of skill on the part of the artist, the meticulous registering of the natural world, the careful handling of colour, the lifelike carving of marble, and so on. And several further questions arise from this fact, including the following. Where does one draw the line between what we might think of as high art and the decorative arts? Is the craft evident in a painting by Van Eyck different from the craft displayed in a gorgeous kimono? Is the element of craft an aspect of the artwork's power to profoundly move the viewer? And how is craft related to the problematic concept of beauty? It's not my primary purpose to attempt to answer these questions here as they pertain to the visual arts. They've been exhaustively discussed by art theorists and critics. Rather, what I want to do is to return to the issue of the affective and cognitive power possessed by certain literary works and complicate the picture by paying more attention to this issue of craft, informed by the parallel with the visual arts. The literary work, I would argue, have argued, is not an object but an event, one that takes place each time it is read as literature and not as something else. The text on the page or the sounds in the air are material entities which can be understood as tokens of a single type. The letters that make up the words of the poem listed as, for example, may appear in different fonts, on differently sized pages, and the work may be read out in many different accents, but we understand that these are all instances of the same poem. However, they only become a poem in the fullest sense when they are read or listened to with the appropriate type of engagement, which involves bringing to the event of the work an array of knowledges and expectations gained from earlier encounters of literature and other discourses. It's this experience, in some degree at least a pleasurable one, even if it includes painful elements, that draws the reader to literary work. Of course, works of literature offer many other kinds of reward, including information about other times and places, insights into an author's biography, philosophical speculations, moral injunctions, and linguistic exemplars. Equally, the varieties of pleasure communicated by literary works are many and diverse. My concern is only what is distinctive about literature, what kinds of pleasure or knowledge literary works alone can vouchsafe. All works of literature, then, can be thought of as verbal events that produce pleasure in the reading. Only some have the potential to generate the experience of being profoundly moved. And it's unfortunate that we're obliged to use the same word for those that do possess this power as for those that don't. Phrases like great literature or literature at its best have unfortunate connotations, and they suggest a black and white permanent distinction when there are enormous differences across individuals, cultures, and historical periods. And whether or not a work does have this potential is something that can only be evidenced in readers' responses, and therefore is never a closed possibility. I've argued elsewhere that the experience in question involves a response to the work's otherness, singularity, and inventiveness. The reader is taken into unfamiliar terrain, whether emotional or cognitive or both, registers the work's unique configuration of cultural, generic, and linguistic material, and takes pleasure in the sense of an author who has succeeded in achieving these qualities through a creative engagement with their culture. As a result of undergoing this experience, the reader is not quite the same as before it, perhaps only minimally and temporarily changed, perhaps momentously and permanently. Turning to works in other artistic modes, I'd argue that similar factors are at work. Just as the series of words only become a literary work when read in an appropriate manner, so a series of sounds only become music when listened to with the appropriate attention, and the visual object only becomes art, painting, or sculpture when viewed in an appropriate fashion. Music's similarity to literature as regards temporality is obvious, but the experience of the viewer of a visual work is also an event, one in which the shapes and colours become more than just shapes and colours. There's also an element of staging created by the operation of form in music and visual art, as there is in literature. Although many visual artworks are presented as straightforward records of reality, portraits for instance, the viewer's experience includes a response to the many formal decisions made by the artist in making the representation. An untouched photograph may come closer to unmediated representation, though even here the viewer treating it as a work of art is responding to the photographer's choices. Absolute music that's not overtly represented in some external reality, is never simply sound, but is formed sound. And it's that forming, even if it's a selection extracted from recorded sound, that makes it a work of art, capable of moving the hearer. 2. The question of craft. How might this account of the work of art be complicated by the introduction of the question of craft? More particularly, how might the account of the literary experience I've given need to be revised when the role of craft on the model of visual art is taken into consideration? To proceed with this issue, we need to attempt a clearer characterization of the distinction between craft and art, as it exists across all art forms. To start with, it's important to note that this is neither a sharp nor a stable distinction. It's not an inherent property in the object, but a feature of the reader's, the viewer's, or in the case of music, the listener's experience, and hence is determined by cultural norms and individual histories that are subject to change, both over an individual's lifetime and in the history of a culture. Nor is it a question of artifacts being divided into two categories. It would be better to speak of a craft element and an art element being co-present in many artworks, or more strictly in individuals' experiences of artworks. This co-presence was evident to the influential originator of one version of the distinction, namely Kant, who employed the terms mechanical art and fine art, the former giving evidence of the operation of rules alone, and the latter the additional operation of what he called genius. Kant observes, even though mechanical and fine art are very different from each other, since the first is based merely on diligence and learning, and the second on genius, yet there is no fine art that does not have as its essential condition something mechanical, which can be encompassed by rules and complied with. End quote. Since Kant's time, artifacts lacking the attributes normally associated with craft have gained acceptance as art. Conceptual art would be one example. But Kant's recognition that much of what we enjoy as art includes a strong element of craft is an important insight. Within the Anglophone philosophical tradition, the most influential set of arguments in favour of a distinction between art and craft was put forward in 1938 by R.G. Collingwood in The Principles of Art. While Collingwood's general theory of art as expression has not worn well, his account of the art-craft distinction has some elements that continue to bear careful examination. Collingwood lists 6 criteria that are valid for craft, but not for art. The most interesting for our purposes being the first 2, which are closely related. Craft always involves a distinction between means and end, each clearly conceived as something distinct from the other, but related to it. The term means is loosely applied to things that are used in order to reach the end, such as tools, machines, or fuel. Strictly, it applies not to the things, but to the actions concerned with them, manipulating the tools, tending the machines, or burning the fuel. These actions, as implied by the literal sense of the word means, are passed through or traversed in order to reach the end and are left behind when the end is reached. And 2, it involves a distinction, that's to say craft involves a distinction between planning and execution. The result to be obtained is preconceived or thought out before being arrived at. the craftsman knows what he wants to make before he makes it. This foreknowledge is absolutely indispensable to craft. If something, for example stainless steel, is made without such foreknowledge, the making of it is not a case of craft, but an accident. Moreover, this foreknowledge is not vague, but precise. If a person sets out to make a table, but conceives the table only vaguely, as somewhere between 2 by 4 feet and 3 by 6, and between 2 and 3 feet high, and so forth, he is no craftsman. Collingwood argues that the production of a work of art, by contrast, proceeds without the formulation first of an end and then of the means to reach it, nor does it involve exact foreknowledge of what is to be produced. Rather, the artist discovers the work of art in the course of the creative activity, a phenomenon widely attested among the comments of artists on their own procedures. Like Kant, Collingwood acknowledges that the creation of the artwork doesn't preclude the operation of craft. There is, of course, an overlap between these two things, as may be seen by the example of a building or a jar, which is made to order for the satisfaction of a specific demand to serve a useful purpose, but may nonetheless be a work of art. Collingwood's approach to art and craft is largely in terms of the differences he sees in the way the producer of the work operates. This is in keeping with his broader views on art as expression. If, as I'm suggesting, it's more helpful to think in terms of the experience of the viewer, reader, or listener, we need to ask how the distinction can be framed from this alternative perspective. What would it mean to assert that in the case of a painted object? Say, the viewer feels that the work has been made in accordance with a pre-existing plan, and is therefore an instance of craft. Such a response may or may not be an accurate reflection of the way the work was actually produced, information about which the viewer is unlikely to have any access. Rather, it's a feeling that the work in question offers the pleasures of a task excellently, often beautifully performed. By contrast, when the work provides a feeling of being taken into new, perhaps exhilaratingly new, cognitive and emotional territory, as if the inventiveness of the maker is being directly experienced, it's being received as a work of art, with its reception as a work of craft being an additional possibility. Accounts of this experience tend to use words like surprise, awe, freshness, newness, revelation, words which could also be used by the creator when finding the material in their hands taking a shape they had not foreseen. Because for both creator and receiver, the experience is one of apprehending otherness of some kind, a new insight into human behavior, a fresh amalgam of concepts, an unfamiliar complex of emotions, a surprising combination of sounds, colors that changes one's response to the world around them. It's usually very difficult to put into words. De Bolle speaks of the mutism engendered by great works of art. They make one turn to silence as the only possible response. Often there's an actual correspondence between the two experiences, that of the producer and that of the receiver, but there's no guarantee that a work produced in this way will be received as invented or reversed. To focus on craft is to bring to the fore several other issues frequently associated with discussions of aesthetics. I've already highlighted the importance of the maker's skill, or rather the perception of the maker's skill. Sometimes skill is evident in intricacy, the deft handling of complex materials. A carpet page of the Lindisfarne Gospels, for instance, or an actual carpet from Iran or Turkey in this case. A motet by Machaut or an opera by Webern, a Welsh Kincaid or an Auden Sistina. As the evident product of unusual dexterity of hand, acuity of eye, or mastery of verbal sound, intricacy is a relatively stable feature across times and places. There isn't much cultural difference among what we perceive as intricately woven or intricately painted works of art, works of craft. But the maker's skill can be evident in many other ways, more dependent on the cultural framework in which they're apprehended, from the choice and arrangement of simple words in Blake's Songs of Innocence to the combinations of colours in a painting by Rothko. In such cases, the respondent may well not be aware of the operation of skill as such, although a sense of the artist's power to create will be at the root of the response. It's not uncommon to recognize the skill involved in producing a particular work, while at the same time finding it ugly and having very little to offer to the viewer. To recognize craft, however, in the sense in which I'm using it, is to have a positive response to the artificer's work. Craft, in other words, is closely associated with beauty, one of the most vexed terms in the lexicon of aesthetics. It is, of course, a highly culture-specific term, a term of judgment, and though I would say not an entirely subjective one. As Kant saw, to say that you find something beautiful is not to mean this is beautiful for me, or even this is beautiful for my culture. However, you might be theoretically aware that this is the case. That's not how it feels. It simply feels beautiful. Closely related to the perception of beauty and a little less culturally varied is the perception of unity or wholeness. The elements in a made work need to cohere for it to be enjoyed as craft. When we enjoy the graceful oneness and shapely design of Brancusi's bird in space, we're enjoying the work as craft. If, in addition to this enjoyment, we experience something akin to the beginning of weightlessness or a movement of inner release, if that's part of the experience, we're engaging with it as a work of art as well. The former response can be put into words without much difficulty. The latter response is impossible to capture verbally with any completeness. In the first case, it's the shaping of the marble by the skilled sculptor to which you're responding. In the second case, it's to his finding a way to reinvent the relation between the material of marble and the experience of gravity. Beauty and unity are not, of course, confined to human-made artifacts, but only in such artifacts are they related to the perception of skill, unless that is, you believe in a creator God responsible for designing the universe. The difference between an experience of the beauty of a cherry tree in bloom and that of a sculpture by Canova lies in the suffusion of the second experience by an awareness of the author's skill. The artist's skill, I should say. To experience an artifact as art, then, is to find one's affective cognitive makeup altered, perhaps temporarily, perhaps for good. We're no doubt all familiar with the way in which an artwork that has stirred us greatly on a particular occasion can produce an echo of that experience when we come across it much later. Even a fleeting encounter can produce a slight shiver of pleasure as the earlier experience is relived. This is one way in which the viewer or reader becomes a different person after being powerfully affected by an artwork. I've argued that the work of art is an event. Can we say the same of a work that's perceived entirely as craft? My answer would be yes, in the sense that reading, listening, and viewing are always temporal events. But the experience of those events is not the same in both cases. The experience of craft could be called appreciation, to use a favourite term of analytic aestheticians, whereas the experience of art, as we've seen, involves an encounter with a hitherto unacknowledged dimension of thought or feeling, made possible by the inventiveness and singularity of the work. Both experiences, therefore, are pleasurable, or we would not seek them out, but in different ways. And I should stress again that it's not a matter of either or. A full response to an artwork is highly complex and may well include admiration of the skill of the artist at the same time as an experience of being taken into new domains of thought and feeling, together with all the other ways in which artworks may provide pleasure and knowledge. Part 3, the theory of techne. Ancient Greek doesn't distinguish between art and craft. The word techne is translated as both, and and in Latin the word ars played a similar role for the Romans. An important contemporary philosophy of art that builds on the idea of techne, and that has many connections with the argument I'm pursuing, has been elaborated by Henry Statton in his recent book, Techne Theory. Statton's account of art, like Collingwood's, is focused primarily on the production of artworks rather than their reception. Techne, he states, is the accretion or sedimentation of myriad acts of trial and error and micro-discovery that come together over generations. This process produces, he says, a system of institutionalized grooves of effectuality, along which we inheritors can to some degree coast. And he goes on, it's in the actual work of making that invention, it's in the actual work of making that invention occurs as the artist encounters rough spots, crossroads, and dead ends, which is where the real cunning or craftiness from technique comes in, where we use it or allowed to use us to make our own original contributions, not only rediscovering old grooves, but making new ones. End quote. The artist's relation to the technique of their particular art form is not one of conscious awareness. It's more deeply embedded than this and manifests itself only in the process of making. For Statton, then, the distinction I'm drawing between works that are or are received as craft alone, and works in which the craft element is combined with an art element, is understood as one of many drawn between the making of works that only repeat inherited skills and habits, and the productive processes that, meeting new challenges, build on the inherited habits and skills to venture into new territory that could not have been envisaged beforehand. And the affinity with Collingwood's account is evident here. The crucial question that arises is, how does the artist discover this hitherto unattested way of making? One feature of the artist's experience has often been recorded, and it's reflected in Statton's qualification: we use it or allow it to use us. There's an undecidability about active and passive in the process of invention. It may seem to the artist that the new thing, it might be a new formal procedure, a new metaphor, a new context of feeling, was out there waiting to be discovered. The etymology of invention as finding may reflect this. And this perception is perhaps only in part an illusion. It may be that the changing cultural environment, including the recent work of other artists, has only now brought certain possibilities within reach. Or, to emphasize the passive aspect of artistic creation, the task of the artist could be seen as creating a space in the inherited cultural materials within which the new thing can make itself known. The rough spots, crossroads, and dead ends that Statton identifies as productive of invention could be thought of as historical changes to the cultural fabric that have rendered the inherited technique methods inadequate in order to produce art that makes sense of the new cultural configuration, bringing light to its dark places. New methods are needed. This will explain the sense of recognition that the strikingly original work often evokes in its first audience, even though it's unprecedented and thus at the same time surprising. Statton cites the example of the wasteland. It also explains the frequently attested sense on the part of the artist that the created work feels right, without being able to explain verbally why this is so. I should say that in this reading of Statton's argument, I am going a bit beyond what he actually argues, and he might disagree with the way I formulated it. What Statton is opposing is the notion, inherited from the Romantics, of a profound divide between the well done and the truly outstanding work of art. The latter only possible through the operation of what he calls a transcendent faculty, genius, inspiration, or imagination. Rather, he argues, it's the supremely skilled maker who, fully at home in the relevant technique, finds a way of going beyond it to bring into existence a successful work of art. The very familiarity with the technique is what enables the artist to sense how it can be surpassed In striking metaphors, Staton writes of, quote, the effervescence of old forms that allows new forms to emerge, and of a potential stirring in its already existing architecture. Approaching this question from the point of view of the receiver, which is my concern in this talk, we may ask, what is the relation between the way in which a work is brought into being, either as an example of inherited technique or as an invented expansion of it, and the experience of the work, either as craft alone, what Staton calls the well-done work, or as art, what he calls the truly outstanding work. As I've suggested, there can be no necessary correlation. It's perfectly possible that a work produced using time-honored techniques could move certain audiences profoundly, and that a work felt by its maker to be one that takes the tradition into wholly new areas could be found uninvented by those encountering it. In the latter case, the artist may be self-deceived, or the culture may not be ready to engage fully with the work. There are many examples of artistic oeuvres that have taken decades or more to find fit audiences. Nevertheless, the sense that a work does more than rehearse familiar techniques may well correspond to the maker's own feeling that something new has been achieved. And strange though it may seem, this correspondence can stretch over long periods of time. The inventiveness of Donne's religious poetry, refashioning the traditions of both sacred verse and the lyric poem, can still be strongly felt today by readers without any specialized grasp of Renaissance literature. The power of Masaccio's expulsion of Adam and Eve can be sensed today by a viewer with no historical knowledge of the painter's innovative methods. Part 4, Craft and Art, Visual and Verbal. We may now briefly examine a work of visual art and one of literary art to take further our discussion of the role of craft and art in the viewer's or reader's experience. In 1738, Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin painted the work known as The Kitchen Maid. Though it was first exhibited in 1739 under the title La Rétisseuse de Navets, the scraper of turnips. The painting was evidently very popular, as there are 4 versions of it extant. This one, in the National Gallery of Art, Washington, is the earliest. I'm going to describe my own experience of it on the assumption that mine is a reasonably unidiosyncratic response, that's to say that I'm reflecting something about the cultural norms that we inhabit at this point in time, but in an awareness that others may respond differently. Part of the point of reporting on one's experiences of art is to engage in a discussion with others. I won't make any detours through cultural or art history. Further knowledge about the painter and the painting is likely to enrich one's response, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm interested in the relatively uninformed viewer's immediate experience. Nor am I engaging with any of the published art criticism which the painting has engendered. My comments were made in response to an image of the painting on my computer screen that was approximately 2/3 the size of the original, which is 46.2 by 37.5 centimeters, though I was able to zoom in when I wanted to. A reproduction, of course, lacks what Benjamin called the aura of the original painting, but this doesn't prevent it from generating a powerful response. As I've noted, the experience of engaging with the work of visual art is, like all engagements with artworks, a temporal one. But the event whereby the viewer takes in the painting differs with each viewer and each viewing. And like a verbal text, or a piece of music for that matter, there's no prescribed order to it. The process may include both a distant view encompassing the whole image and a close scrutiny of detail, which is where the usefulness of a zoom function comes in. I'll start with some of the smaller details. I find I take immense pleasure in the skill with which domestic particulars are represented. The tiny touches of paint that bring out the sheen of the copper frying pan and the surface of the water in which the peeled and chopped turnips are sitting. The glint of the silver band around the knife handle and the mottled orange in the pumpkin. The small splash of blood on the chopping block and the minuscule gleam on the cleaver. The spots of dirt on the woman's apron, and a scuff on the upright of the chair. Each object has its distinctive texture, whether it's the rough moulding of the basin, the uneven surface of the cooking pan, the smooth metal of the frying pan, or the coarse outer skin of the turnips. The woman's skirt and apron fall in heavy folds without any hint of the elaborate drapery suggestive of fine cloth favoured by so many other painters as a demonstration of painting skill. If one were to bring in contextual information, an obvious point to make would be the contrast between Chardin's painting and that of his Rococo contemporaries. It's not a question of photographic realism, however. I remain constantly aware that it's paint that's furnishing these details, its own texture evident at the same time as the textures it's depicting. This awareness is also an awareness of the activity of the artist in making the painting. Moving back a little, I find the compositional unity of the painting immensely satisfying. The woman forms a dominant but not central triangle, and her shape is balanced by the accumulation of solid implements in front of her: basin, frying pan, cooking pan, and cleaver on its substantial tree trunk block. Colour plays a major part in my enjoyment. The several shades of orange, skirt, pumpkin, pans are contrasted with the three instances of white: the bonnet, the apron, and whitest of all, so that they almost seem to have their own source of light, the peeled turnips. The blue of the inside of the basin echoes the blue of the woman's scarf. The red of the blood repeats the red of her skirt and of her lips. And I take pleasure in the representation of a human figure with a robust presence, her frame solid, her clothes practical, her face slightly flushed as if with recent exercise, her hands evoking strength rather than grace. All this I enjoy as craft, as the superbly skilled use of paint and remarkable control of form and colour. I sense an artist who has fully absorbed the technique of his art as he inherited it in early 18th century France. Most of my encounters with the painting involve a pleasurable response to some of these features. But a fuller engagement with the painting, only possible if the material and psychological conditions are right, affects me in ways that go beyond this pleasurable appreciation, an experience that's much harder to find words for. I'm moved especially by the evocation of a pause in the busy activity of necessary labour. The woman has stopped in mid-action, the turnip only partly peeled and almost dropped, the knife still held, pointing away from it, and the heap of unpeeled vegetables awaiting attention. In place of the animated and focused expression that is easy to imagine on the woman's face as she undertakes her task, we find a blankness, whether of deep thought or of the absence of thought. Whatever it is, it's one with a sense of arrested motion, of a timeless moment arising in the midst of the rush of time. To experience this while looking at the painting is to experience more than an enjoyment of artistic skill. It's to discover, as if for the first time, the quality of stillness that can be found miraculously at the heart of noise and activity. The experience is not quite cognitive, not quite affective, but partakes of both. Why the woman has paused, what she is thinking, if she is thinking at all, are secrets that can never be revealed. And this absence of implied narrative is part of the experience of letting be, of emptying out, that the painting makes possible. Now, to say that this experience is more than an enjoyment of the artist's skill is not to say that we forget we're responding to the work of a creator. On the contrary, the more powerful the encounter, the more the astonishment we're likely to feel at the artist's achievement. To put it in Collingwood's terms, the painting comes across as a discovery on the part of the artist, not as a work carried out in accordance with a preconceived plan. Turning now to the question of craft and art in literary works, we may take a very short poem, also concerned with the serving maid, to begin to explore the same issues. Once more, I'm reporting on my own response, and I'm aware that this won't necessarily necessarily be shared. In what does the enjoyment of craft in a verbal work of art consist? And is it possible to experience anything like the affective and cognitive sense of discovery that this painting affords? The poem I've chosen is by Robert Herrick from his collection Hesperides, published in 1648. Once again, I begin by making no reference to the historical and biographical context. I've modernized the spelling, by the way. Upon proof is made. In this little urn is laid Prudence Baldwin, once my maid, from whose happy spark here leapt spring with purple violet. Herrick, like Chardin, is highly adept in the technique inherited from previous generations of craftspeople, in his case, the makers of lyric poems in English and in other languages, in Latin in particular. Something that even a cursory reading of the hundreds of poems in Hesperides makes clear. In order to write a poetic epitaph appropriate for a servant, he chooses the simplest possible metrical form, one with a long history. 4 lines of 4-beat verse made up of 2 rhyming couplets, employing a strict ducal meter and beginning and ending each line on a beat. It's a form of clear unity that creates a feeling of strong closure on the final syllable. We just read those lines again so we sense the way meter is used to create a sense of wholeness, completion, conclusion. In this little urn is laid Prudence Baldwin, once my maid, from whose happy spark here let spring the purple violet. Herrick also employs an inherited poetic genre, one which implies a funerary practice more common in ancient Greece and Rome than in 17th century England. Cremation followed by the placing of the ashes in a decorative urn. The littleness of the urn is both a reflection on the material contrast between the living and the dead, and an intimation of the low status of the deceased. And the little urn in which Prudence is held is also, of course, the tiny poem itself, the real container in contrast to the imagined urn. Herrick's skillful play with the idea of the funerary urn goes further in the prayer that occupies the second half of the poem. The ashes contained within it are supposed to be not entirely extinguished. There's a spark remaining, as if a being as lively as Prudence could not be entirely reduced to dead matter. And the poet's equally impossible prayer is that from this spark a flower might grow, so full of remaining life are the ashes. Herrick's talent is evident in the economy with which he works with words. Happy, for instance, combines several meanings, including fortunate, blessed, and joyful. Spark unites the physical ember with the promise of something new. And spring, a word chosen in place of the simple grow, adds to the sense of energetic new life. The poem ends with an image both of beauty and of humility, the traditional symbolic meaning of violet, although perhaps the mention of purple balances humility with a suggestion of royalty. Where for me an experience of the poem moves beyond a pleasurable demonstration of Herrick's skill and becomes a work of art is the second line, which is perhaps the least poetic of the 4 lines. The poem's title suggests the familiar, though perhaps slightly patronizing way a master might address a servant by means of the shortened form, Prue. And we've seen how the first line may come across as implying her lowly status. But now the poem names her in full, a moment in which the master-servant relationship is set aside and the woman is treated with the respect due to any fellow human being. Prudence Baldwin, once my maid. The phrase once my maid implies not only Prudence's death, but that she's no longer being thought of as a servant. Once my maid. Again, this movement beyond craft is difficult to put into words. I experience an inner movement of appreciative warmth, sharing briefly a sense of humanity that exceeds social norms. The lines that follow maintain this feeling of shared generosity. There are no grand gestures, minimal ethical impulses evoked and celebrated, no more than a little poem should encompass. Although we'll never know if Herrick set out very deliberately to write a poem in which the use of a full name has the power to move the reader, it doesn't come across as a carefully planned work. Its inventiveness feels like a surprise for both author and reader. A modicum of biographical knowledge adds further richness and complexity to the poem. And I should add that I'm not suggesting that we should read poems or look at paintings without any knowledge. I mean, such knowledge usually adds to the depth of our response. So a particular fact about this poem and about Herrick's own life is that Prudence Baldwin in fact outlived him. So the poem is not only about an imaginary funeral procedure, but about an imaginary death. It's even more evidently a tribute to Prudence than we would guess without this information. A tribute that allows her to know, long before her death, how much she is valued by her master. These two examples offer relatively simple illustrations of the operation of craft in art. Other examples, obviously, complicate the argument. To take one instance, as I suggested earlier, conceptual art demands a somewhat different understanding of craft. If we take pleasure in Warhol's notorious Brillo boxes, it's not because of the skill with which they were painted, but because of the creative challenge they represent to the traditions of visual art. Whether we want to think that craft is not an issue here is a question we might discuss. The means by which works of art in either medium are able to go beyond craft to provide the experience of inventive openings onto new horizons of thought and feeling, or of thought feeling, are manifold. But I hope I've convinced at least some of you that there's some value in considering them together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thanks for that. This journey into the distinctions and the overlappings between craft and art, and ultimately, I suppose, trying to grapple with the profound, extraordinary experience of the event of art. I'm sure it raises lots of questions and sort of observations. So I'm going to turn this over to the floor. So if anybody has any questions, feel free. I mean, this can be online, but it can also be here. Yeah, they're all very shy.
It's a very large room. It's a very large room, quite inhibiting.
Indeed. Okay, we have one question here.
Hi, Derek. I mean, thanks for that, stimulating and, well-formed, talk, taking us through the ways in which craft interacts with technique. I've got two questions. The first is targeting your first section. We talk about pleasure, as a kind of sensible response, effective response that generates, a kind of aesthetic emotion. I'm wondering about pain as a kind of dialectical opposite. In fact, one of the first paintings I saw was Ivan the Terrible. That painting where where the kind of dominant emotion, is one of horror, terror, abject abjecthood. But I couldn't pull myself away, in looking at that. That kind of generated, kind of puzzling, yet complex, kind of response, mediated through the horrible subject matter. So I'm wondering what you thought about pain, as opposed to pleasure. I guess my second question is, you employ very consciously the language of the Anglo-American tradition. Is that a kind of conscious choice here? because when you talk about technique, to my ear, Heidegger kind of comes up. The idea of art as technique, as revelation, as a kind of philosophical unveiling of existence. So I'm wondering whether the kind of the continental tradition, is it a conscious choice on your part to kind of use the language of the Anglo-Americans, Shaftesbury, and so on, Dewey, for instance, in a sense, using that to kind of underpin your argument.
Great, thanks very much for those questions. Yeah, the word pleasure is too simple, isn't it? What I mean by pleasure is simply that there is something positive. As you say, you couldn't pull yourself away from that picture. There's something that draws one to these works of art, even if they are depictions of pain, suffering, horror. I think one of the interesting things about craft is that it can be used, the artist's or the writer's skill can be used equally to depict happy, joyful, uplifting subjects and the most dark and miserable ones. So craft is simply happens, can be carried out irrespective of those oppositions. But the other notion that I'm putting next to craft, of art as something that changes the viewer or the reader through some kind of journey into the unexpected, the unknown, the unforeseen. My argument is that that's always a positive journey, a positive experience of discovery, even if that is a discovery of, the horrors that human beings can do to one another. It's still a discovery. It's still, in some sense, pleasurable. I understand your hesitation, but in some sense, it's a positive experience because it is life enhancing in some way, discovery of new horizons. So I would agree that pleasure, the simple word pleasure, is too simple. And there are many dimensions to the positivity that art arouses. Your second question, in a way, you have put your finger on something in my own intellectual journey here, because all my earlier work was heavily influenced by the continental tradition and very little by the analytic tradition. And this is something of an attempt to see what can be made of that other tradition, and if the two can be brought together. So as I said, the analytic tradition likes to talk about appreciation. And I've had conversations, discussions, debates with analytic philosophers who find my insistence on the work of art as opening onto new horizons inadequate or limiting or too narrow. So this is an attempt in a way to bring together the analytic tradition's insistence on craft, on unity, often on beauty, and my own past thinking about the experience of the artwork, which doesn't necessarily involve art, craftsmanship, skill, beauty, wholeness. For me, art can lack all those things and still be powerful. But I wanted to find a way to bring those, in a sense, bring those two traditions together.
Anybody else? Over here.
Hi, good afternoon, Prof. Thank you very much for the talk. As I was listening, I was very curious about the examples that you chose. And my question is quite brief. I wondered, in your thinking about this intersection between art, craft, and literature, where you might think of something like ekphrastic poetry, and like ekphrasis, and how like because the literary bit often comes as a response to something that is first crafted or presented as a work of art. And I was just a bit curious what might some of your current thoughts be on that relation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of ekphrastic poetry in particular. If the writer succeeds in conveying the powerful skill of the visual artist, so ekphrastic poetry, ekphrastic literature, if that's unfamiliar to you, the depiction in verbal terms of a visual work of art. So if you feel in reading the work of literature that the work of art, that the skill involved in the work of art, or in my terms, the power of the work of art as a work of art, if either of those or both of those come across, then you do have a kind of layering, don't you? Because in the first instance, you're responding to the poetry, or to the verbal work of art. And you're admiring, enjoying, taking pleasure in the writer's skill, who has succeeded in bringing to your visual imagination something which is not verbal but visual. But you may also be, through that imaginative exercise, being invited to appreciate the skill of another artist. So it's a quite complex process. For me, it doesn't often happen that the writer really does convey the work of art to that degree. I mean, the general sense of what the picture might be, or the tapestry might be, or whatever. But it's quite a challenge to convey in words. As I've been saying, actually, to try and convey the individual receiver of a work of art in the fullest sense is difficult anyway, verbally. And so, yeah, it's a challenge for the writer. But it does happen, you're right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Really insightful. Just got a very short question. Since you talk about art and craft and literature, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on books as pieces of both art and literature and craft? Of course, now we are looking at many different ways in which books are produced, but especially if you go back to history and the ways in which they were manually created, individually crafted. Just wondering what are your thoughts on that?
You mean the material object of the book?
That's right, and
Yeah.
the way in which you put together as well.
Yeah. Well, in general, I think when we read in the traditional way, if we're sensitive readers, we're going to be aware of the materiality of what we read, as well as the words as abstract, as I was saying, tokens of a certain type. So it's certainly possible to find pleasure in the craftswork, that's the word, in the craft of the produced book. That would usually, I suppose, be on a separate plane. You can have it at the same time, but on a separate plane from the content and the verbal skill that one is responding to. I'm trying to think of an example where maybe, well, I don't know, Blake's illuminated books, maybe we would feel at the same time the craft work of his illustration and the verbal craft coming through together. So yeah, there may well be examples of combined crafts and indeed combined art. We might, I can think of plates from Blake's Jerusalem, for instance, where I feel simultaneously the power of the image, that is the hawk rising, and the power of the words written out below. So yeah, I'm talking about. Thanks very much.
Yeah, you did point out an example of Andy Warhol's pillow boxes. Now, would you say works that don't show traditional craft or skill For instance, I can think of like Malevich, Black Square, or in music would be John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, would you say the skill or craft in works like that are exhibited by the recognition of the skill of the artist, seeing that such works fit into the zeitgeist or the history of art for that time?
Yeah, it's a question that I've been puzzling over. I mean, there would be two ways to go, wouldn't there? There'd be one to say that not every work of art is an example of craft, and that particularly in the 20th century, it became evident that it's possible to produce powerful and moving works of art without craft, with something else, with an inspiration that you could intervene in the art world in a certain way and change people's minds that way and give them a sense of a thrill, a sense of challenge, etc., etc., etc. And the craft doesn't come into it, something else comes into it. Or you could expand your definition of craft and say I wanted to include the cleverness, if you like, with which Warhol or Malevich or Cage understood, you say, the zeitgeist, the sense of what the culture could accept and challenge it. And I don't know which way to go, to be honest. And maybe it's you decide how you want to use the word craft. I started this by thinking primarily because the trajectory of my thinking was to look at works of art, traditional works of art, which are where it's quite clear that what you're enjoying when you're enjoying the work of art is the meticulous skill of the painter or the sculptor, and then to move across from there to literature. So I was tending towards the form to say those are places where the craft is something we actually enjoy. In the case of Warhol or Duchamp, not really enjoying craft. So I think I would tend to say that, but I can see why other people might want to expand and say, well, you can still appreciate what a clever thing it was to do without feeling its power as a work of art. So there are still two possible ways of responding there. I don't know, do you have a preference? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got one over here.
Hi, thank you so much for the insightful talk, Prof. I just have a question and it pertains to touch. So it's basically, how might we consider craft and art in relation to touch, texture, and tactility, and how might we shift these considerations onto works of prose? Because to say that we are profoundly moved also echoes the feeling that we have also been touched by it, that the work resonates through our bodies and reverberates within it, right? And the examples of visual art and poetry, we sort of benefit from them because, say, visual art, we are touching with the eyes, we are sort of looking at them. At the same time, for poetry, it's something that we hear, and I think that also has to do with touching, right? The sound waves and all that. So I was wondering, how might we fit prose into such an approach? Thank you.
Thank you. So you're thinking of both the metaphoric use of touch, so that I was really touched by that poem, it moved me, but also something more literal, that we touch the visual object with our eyes. I would say that our bodies respond to the rhythm of language. Yeah, I think that's definitely part of what it is to respond to a work of art. You didn't actually ask this, but the question would be then, do we respond to craft in that way, or is craft much more a distance thing? Is appreciating the skill of the artist something we look at from a distance, whereas to engage with something as a work of art, as a true work of art, is to be touched by it, to be physically engaged by it. And I think that's probably true. I mean, there may be some counter-arguments that craft can also touch us in some way. I mean, we still see it, we still have a physical response to it. But I think it would be true to say that a powerful response to a work of art will always involve a more intense mode of touching, being touched by the object. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
We've got one up here. Oh, first.
Thank you for that talk. It was really interesting to hear. And just adding on to that idea of touch and being physically affected by works of art, I'm actually interested in the way you've been using the phrase affective, cognitive affective, and particularly when you said that your response to art is not strictly cognitive and not strictly affective, but it partakes in both. So I'm kind of navigating those waters myself in my research, and it's a headache.
Yeah.
So I just want to know how do you distinguish the two, or how do you navigate that relationship between responding to a work of art in a cognitive way, which I take to mean things like interpretation and knowledge and culture. That's where all these things come in for me, for connection, and effect comes in terms of touch and tactility and visceral responses to that. But I'm not sure if it's strictly distinct that way, or if, because from what I'm hearing from you is that it's kind of intertwined, but I'm not sure if it can be intertwined without first being distinct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, that's great. I did, in the end, towards the end of the talk, put them together with a hyphen, so
Yeah.
cognitive affective or affective cognitive, because, well, the first thing to say, again, is that the fullest response to the work of art is very difficult to put into words, so no wonder you're finding this a headache. But to me, and one could talk about the purely cognitive, when a work of literature helps you to see literally a new relationship, a metaphor helps you to understand a relationship you didn't understand before, or a work of visual art helps you to understand what a miracle might be, a religious painting or something. So, there's something could be purely cognitive. But I take it that if it's really engaging you as a work of art, that very cognitive discovery is itself something you feel emotionally, affectively, as well as cognitively. It's not just an idea formed in your mind. It's different from someone explaining something to you, which would be purely cognitive. The work of art does it through affect as well. To cognize, to understand, to know, to learn, is itself, as I was saying earlier, pleasurable. That word's not too simple. Partly because it's affective as well as cognitive. And you could turn it the other way around. I suppose you could say if a work of art affects you deeply emotionally, that very emotional response is a kind of learning of a new complex of emotions, a new shade of emotions that you've never quite experienced before. So I do see them as inseparable, and that I would prefer it to be one word rather than having to put them together with a hyphen.
Okay, thank you.
One more here.
Hi Gary, thank you so much for that talk that so elegantly puts together the three terms, literature, art, and craft. I was particularly taken by your observation that in the creation of art there is no foreknowing and there's no foreknowledge. And I'm wondering, even with that in mind, the artist sort of finds a knowing in the process of creating an art piece by sort of feeling his or her way through it. And I'm wondering how you would describe such knowing, which is like praxis but not quite as well because it's not foreclosed. So wondering what your thoughts might be.
Sorry, could you just say that last bit again?
The distinction that you draw between art and craft is that when an artist creates, there is no foreclosure or foreknowledge of the finished art piece.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in the process of creation, there's a kind of knowing, a knowingness that comes with putting together various components, or perhaps in the case of choreographing a dance, it is feeling and sculpting that movement. So I'm wondering how you would understand such knowing or pre-knowing.
Yeah. The idea that, Henry Statton's idea that the real artist is one who's fully at home in a tradition without even knowing how much they know of the tradition. It's just there. They've imbibed it, inherited it. So it's to use the old distinction. It's knowing how to rather than knowing something. Know how rather than knowledge. And I think it's that I would put my emphasis on in thinking about the creative process. The kind of knowing that's actually conscious and, knowing how certain moves in choreography work in certain ways and create certain effects. Of course, that's important. But if it goes beyond the craft of knowing, what works and what doesn't work, if something new emerges in the process, then it's surely more than just knowing in the conscious sense. It's a kind of drawing on inherited. What is Statton's word? Grooves. It's like having grooves which you just find yourself running along. So that's the kind of knowing that I think is the most important in the work of art. Not craft, on the other hand, at least as Colin would argue, is a kind of conscious knowing. I know that in order to produce a visual pattern, I need these colors, I need them to be arranged like this, etc., etc. And that's the other kind of knowledge, which goes into art, but it's not sufficient to create an art.
Thanks so much.
And we have one up here. And
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your inspiring talk. I just have one brief question. What do you think about the literary works produced by artificial intelligence? For example, those novels written by ChatGPT in recent days. Would you consider it as art, craft, or anything else?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Novels written by?
ChatGPT. Have you ever heard of it?
this is the.
Oh, ChatGPT. Yes. Right.
You knew that was coming.
I sort of expected that, yes. ChatGPT, any bot like that is simply, I shouldn't say simply, but all it is the accumulation of human writing, human words that become a vast data bank, right? So anything that ChatGPT or any similar program produces is a selection of what other humans have written. And I suppose whether it can produce something which you would enjoy as craft would depend entirely on the skill of the creators of the program and the data bank that it's drawing from. But it could come across. If you gave me a piece of writing and didn't tell me that it was produced by a computer, I could still find it an example of craft. It might have a very complex rhyme scheme, for instance, which a computer can probably do more quickly than any of us. So yes, you could be impressed by the craft of a ChatGPT production. Whether you would ever be able to program something to produce a work of verbal art, a verbal work that I would respond to as a work of art is, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but not very likely, given what we know about how creation happens. But I suppose I would go back to what I was saying earlier, that although when we respond to the inventiveness of a work of art, we do feel we're sharing the inventiveness of the creator as it was created. This can be an illusion. It might have been, written in a state of boredom or inebriation, or there's no necessary connection between how something was produced and how we respond to it. And then if we're told how it was produced, it can actually affect our response. So my answer would be that I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a profound work of literature being produced by a program of that sort. But if I was then told how it would be produced, it would probably just vanish, would no longer be a work of art.
We have a question from our online audience, Derek, if you don't mind. I can read it, the print is a bit small. Aside from the cognitive and affective aspects of art, what about the ethical aspect? When we respond to art, is the ethical also deeply intertwined with the cognitive and the affective?
Thank you, Anonymous. Yes, the answer is yes. I have argued this in the past. Not so much in the sense that we learn ethical and moral lessons from literature, although we can, but that, to me, that's not treating it as literature, that's treating it as something else. But that the very willingness to be taken into new realms of thought and feeling, or thought feeling, by a work of art is itself an ethical response. And the rewards that we get from art when we do approach it in that way, I think, are have an ethical dimension, because they contribute to the creation of a human being who has a kind of generosity of spirit, let's say. These words are not really the right words, but it's very hard to put these things into words as well. A kind of generosity of spirit that is willing to be changed, willing to hear the voice of otherness, to step outside of one's own habitual frame of reference, and to be exposed to what can go back to the very first question, can be quite painful and difficult, as well as in some ways very interesting. So yes, and the answer, to get back to my answer, which is yes. Okay.
Let's hope Anonymous is happy with that. We have one more. Okay, so we can take one more.
Hi, thank you, Prof. That was a really insightful talk. My question is more related to what you just mentioned earlier about like the unknown. So would you say that the cognitive and affective experience of art is driven by the unknown? And in that sense, is craft inherently postmodern in its resistance to give a stable answer or interpretation of it?
Sorry, could you say that again? Is craft?
Is craft inherently postmodern in its resistance to give a stable answer or interpretation of it? Would you say that?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. Postmodern. Postmodern is a tricky term, but I would only use it of a very specific period in cultural history. And craft is something that, for me, can be found in the very earliest human creations. The cave drawings from 4,000 years ago can exhibit craft. So no, I wouldn't want to tie it down to any label like postmodern. I would insist that it's a timeless and cross-cultural phenomenon. Unlike perhaps the more difficult question of what constitutes a work of art, because obviously many cultures don't valorize art, the kind of art that I've been talking about. Although let's say we in the West, might find that they work like works of art, but they may not be conceived in any such way.
Okay, thanks, Dirk. I do want to just ask this question, which is online, because it's kind of localizing things a little bit. You mentioned artists are at home with a tradition and create art without much thinking. Should you say that? But for young countries or societies like Singapore without much of a tradition, what can artists do?
Yeah, that's good. Yes, the point is that I was just following Henry Stanton's argument there that art can only be produced by those who are fully at home in a tradition. But I realise now that the word a tradition is limiting. The possibilities are out there in the world at large. It's quite possible to be in an extremely young culture, but draw on that culture's forebears, if you like. Singapore was blessed in being able to draw on many cultures. So it's not a question of a particular nation state or community. The Greek poets, if someone is steeped in Greek period poetry, that might well be an element in their creative writing, wherever the world is, they are in the world, whatever culture they belong to. So yes, so tradition's a dangerous word, maybe. What we're talking about are creators who have spent time and energy and thought and dedication to the work of their predecessors, whether those predecessors are in their own locality or whether those predecessors are elsewhere in the world. There's no restriction on what one hopes in a free society. There's no restriction on what one can read or view and enjoy.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, unless there are any other pressing questions, I suggest we bring this to a close. Okay, so thank you very much, Jerry. Thanks very much.